welcome to Unscripted. In this episode, I had the chance to catch up with Kevin Donnelly, Executive Director and Chief Advocacy Officer at the Real Estate Technology and Transformation Center, or RETTC for short. Now, you may be asking, what is RETTC? What is its focus? Well, officially rolled out at NMHC OpTech this past October, RETTC is an organization that is revolutionizing the way communities work, live, and play with the responsible investment and deployment of cutting-edge real estate technologies. They help communities achieve greater housing affordability and better outcomes through the transformative power of technology. Okay, so what does that really mean? Well, that's exactly what Kevin and I discuss, as well as how each and every one of us can get involved in the critical mission of raising awareness of how technology, applied well, is a force for good in real estate. Before we get into it, just a reminder that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the individual hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of LeaseLock. The content is intended for general informational purposes only and should not be construed as professional advice or endorsements. While we strive to ensure that the content is as accurate and up-to-date as possible, LeaseLock makes no representations or warranties of any kind, expressed or implied, regarding the accuracy, completeness, or reliability of the information discussed. The content is provided as is, and LeaseLock assumes no responsibility for any errors or omissions. Listeners should consult with qualified professionals before making any decisions based on the content of this podcast. This podcast may include references to third-party sources, which are provided for convenience and informational purposes only. LeaseLock does not endorse or take responsibility for the accuracy or reliability of any third-party content. In no event shall LeaseLock, its affiliates, or any of its employees, officers, or agents be liable for any direct, indirect, incidental, special, or consequential damages arising out of or in conjunction with the use or the reliance of the content of this podcast. Now, with the highly scripted disclaimer out of the way, let's get unscripted with Kevin Donnelly. Well, Kevin, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to give you a little bit of warning. You're the first one we've done remotely for the Unscripted podcast. And as I've said on other episodes, the tech guy for Unscripted is a little bit sketchy considering he's me. So I apologize in advance for anything we might experience.
That's all good. We're used to the fly by the seat of your pants kind of approach here at RETTC. We're good.
Well, I mean, RETTC is absolutely brand new. And I don't want to take for granted that the listeners and the viewers of this actually know what RETTC is, or even that it's an acronym for something else. So Kevin, why don't we start with what's that overview of what RETTC is and kind of what's your role with it?
Sure. Well, first, Andrew, thank you and the team for having us here. I'm Kevin Donnelly. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Advocacy Officer for the Real Estate Technology and Transformation Center, RETTC. We are an organization strategically aligned with the National Multifamily Housing Council, NMHC. Many of your viewers probably know NMHC for its longstanding presence in the multifamily space. RETTC really is a recommitment or a doubling down on the promise of technology, not just in multifamily, but across real estate by our leadership. And the goal really is to level up our presence, the services we provide to our members and to the industry across the board on just how tech can be a force for good in real estate, improve resident outcomes, housing affordability. So many of our long-term housing challenges and the work we've done at NMHC, building off of that leadership, really finds a new home at RETTC. So we're really excited about this moment.
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to get into with you, Kevin, because I've heard RETTC being interpreted in different ways by different folks in the organization or
Sure.
the industry. The big kickoff really was OpTech. At
Sure.
OpTech, there was the big, reveal as to what was going on. But I think, with no fault of you guys, but I think a lot of people, especially if they just looked at LinkedIn posts, thought RETTC was, oh, there's a new Android bot that is sharing things with the industry. So when you're thinking about how we raise the messaging that technology for good in housing, what are kind of the main approaches that you guys are taking? Because I think I have a philosophy that if everything's important, nothing is. So I have to imagine you've kind of narrowed down to what are the important things.
Yeah. I mean, I think let's start with why RETTC was ultimately spun out of NMHC, right?
Sure.
NMHC really was the leader, not just in multifamily, but in many ways across real estate on technology issues, whether it was industry-facing initiatives, data standards, or if it was really leading the charge on, data privacy or security or connectivity. all of these different, pieces of work really now shifts over to RETTC. Part of that is because the issues confronting the broader real estate market, and certainly multifamily, are of such high consequence that we really needed a dedicated team, dedicated resources, bandwidth, really to promote technology and the role it plays in our marketplace at a much higher level, much deeper sense. So, I think when you look at RETTC, it really does a number of things, and it's going to speak to different audiences. First is industry facing, much like the work we've done at NMHC. It's taking all of our tech and innovation, industry facing committees, peer-to-peer groups, all of that networking and really leveraging the industry's expertise in these areas, taking that to RETTC on a 365 posture. Too often, really good conversations were had at OpTech or other industry conferences, and then they fall by the wayside. We want to make sure that peer-to-peer exchange is a strong pillar of the community. Second is the convenings, making sure that the convenings that we have currently, OpTech being our flagship marquee conference, that it really meets the moment. What does the industry need moving forward? So we're going to look to evolve there. But we're also going to build out a calendar of, of convenings, both virtually and in person, to make sure that the industry is getting what it needs to navigate a complex marketplace, a really tough regulatory landscape, and ultimately in an attempt to improve business operations and efficiencies, right? So there's certainly that. And then, I touched on it quickly, but the role of advocacy in both the housing and the technology spaces has really come to a watershed moment where never before, and I think we saw this in this previous national election, never before has housing been a kitchen table issue like it was this year. And for good or bad, NMHC has really done a great job of elevating housing and housing affordability, housing supply challenges to the top of the list for priorities for many policymakers across the country. The role of tech, as we all know, has really come under the microscope at the federal level, at the state and local level, in the public discourse, and certainly in the press. Now, our job at RETTC really is to make sure that policymakers and the press and our renters, our public, really understand the intersection of real estate and technology and the power it can have in moving the needle on addressing some of our nation's long-term housing challenges, or in a broader sense, economic development challenges. So we're really bullish on the fact that tech is a force for good in real estate. You've heard me say that at OpTech. You're going to hear me say that a million more times. I think getting that message across to policymakers before they go down a road of regulation or legislation, or, we find ourselves in the court of public opinion, we want to make sure that folks understand the technologies that are being deployed and the positive role that they're having in the marketplace.
Well, I definitely want to finish up with advocacy, because I personally, that was an eye-opening one for me, being at OpTech and doing advocacy day. But let's start with the other two pillars that you focused in on first.
Yeah.
The first one that you mentioned on was the peer-to-peer relationship and the peer-to-peer communications that I agree with the efforts of RETTC should and can go much deeper than just a 3-day conference at OpTech. What are your thoughts, and what are the efforts, and what can people expect from that peer-to-peer? Like, what does that look like in these early stages?
Yeah, I think NMHC for the better part of the past decade or more has had really strong technology-focused committees, whether it was intelligent buildings and connectivity, or marketing leaders, data security and privacy. All of that body of work moves to RETTC, finds a new home with dedicated resources and staffing. But we also find ourselves at a moment where the technology landscape has shifted so much and so fast in the past decade that we want to make sure that those committees and these peer-to-peer opportunities are really meeting the moment and the need of the market. So, for example, our biggest change is that we are going to pull a seat up to the table for the supplier community. We know that owners and operators have a lot on their plate. We know that for us to effectively navigate this marketplace from an owner-operator perspective, or from a policymaker perspective, we need the thought leadership of experts, whether it's engineers, whether it's software developers, you pick it. It's the thought leadership and the ability to talk through and explain technology that will help us weather this storm of, whether it's in the press or in policy circles or in our own organizations, helping us navigate what is the right solution to deploy at the enterprise level or at the site level. So all of these things, I think, coming together really pushed us to a point where we knew we needed to level up our presence and the peer-to-peer exchanges, but really to make sure that it was a balanced conversation informed by experts and not just by folks who have one sliver of their job focused on prop tech or focused on X. We knew that we needed to bring the supplier community much deeper into the fold.
Well, and as someone who's on that side of the equation, but spent 20 years on the other side of the equation before coming over, I want to say thank you on behalf of the supplier community in that regards, because I think that there are a lot of people that can bring a lot of value to those tables, as you put that chair up there. A great example that you guys are working on right now, in fact, I got the notice on it, I think yesterday, was the MITS feed. The MITS feed and the addition of categorized fees is a great example, I think, of where you have to have the ILSs and the website support and everything else to be able to be at that table to consume it. You've also got to have the property management systems that are at the table to be able to provide that in a way that operations is then shaping to say, okay, here's the type of fees that we use. And if people aren't familiar with that update, it's huge, and in my opinion anyways is actually going to really change the way that marketers have to think about how they're presenting their assets and ultimately a net price. I mean, is that kind of the things you're talking about, where bringing the suppliers to the table is helping those conversations?
That's right. Yeah. So even before we launched RETTC, our first major initiative really got underway as we were building RETTC and preparing the launch at OpTech 2024. We saw this need and market opportunity for both suppliers from the PMS firms, the ILS firms, and the owner-operator community to come together and really look for ways to use tech, use the MITS data model that has long been in the marketplace that NMHC led 20 plus years ago to really, modernize and operationalize a lot of what needed to happen on the software side. Really updated to account for the challenges in the operational space right now. And we all know that one of the greatest areas of scrutiny that we have found ourselves in from a public policy standpoint, and this is not just at the federal level, but increasingly across the state and local landscape, has been this debate over fee transparency. And it's a well-intended effort in many ways for policymakers to look at, quote unquote, junk fees. Now, across the economy, I think we can all see places where we agree that junk fees are a problem. Whether it's you go to buy a concert ticket and suddenly you expect to pay $50, but by the time you get to checkout, it's $125. We understand that. What we've had to do on fees has really been a twofold problem: is battling both ongoing legislation and regulation in this space with the notion that in rental housing that fees passed on to consumers were junk and not what they really are, fees for service. Whether it's for application fees, whether it be for pet fees or parking fees, you pick your fee. What this new effort really tries to do is get ahead of these regulations, almost put them to the side and say, for us to, as an industry, work together as tech suppliers and owner operators, we need to come up with definitions, we need to come up with common treatment, and really update these models, first and foremost, so that residents have a fair shake, so that they see a transparent pricing structure at the front end of the lease transaction. So we're working, I think it's been at lightning speed, and it's been really impressive to watch all of these diverse stakeholders come together, and not just from conventional housing operations. It's been, we were intentional in pulling a group together of affordable housing operators, senior housing, student housing, really cut across the rental space, and then bring in a ton of different stakeholder voices from the tech community to help us get to this point. And so our hope is that by early 2025, we will be on pace to release an updated data model that will be impactful to both the housing provider side of this equation, the tech supplier side, and importantly, the renter side.
Yeah, I know I love the efforts that are going on. I'm not just saying that. I was actually the moderator of a panel at NAA Apartmentalize where
Yeah,
we were literally discussing, is it ancillary income or is it junk fees? And what kind of the panel overwhelmingly came to the conclusion of is, junk fee and non-junk fee, really, let's not talk about it as a junk fee. It's a charge for service when it's applied
sure.
correctly. But it's the challenge we identified was like, how do you bring transparency to it as early and as often as possible in the leasing cycle, which I think that the updates to the MITS feed largely will do, especially if ILSs and corporate websites, et cetera, are presenting what I'm going to call net pricing at the beginning of a customer journey, as to your point with the tickets, and then until it's at the end of the customer journey.
Yeah.
And I do think that operators and marketers and owners need to be thinking about that now from a customer perspective, because we do make a lot of decisions on what my rent is going to be, what's going to be included in rent versus what's a fee based on how I show up on a search, and that's going to change. Right. So it's something for groups to definitely be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's both regulatory pressure, but let's also be clear. I mean, this is industry practice, right? To their credit, our partners over at the National Apartment Association and their lease product, we've pointed to that document in collaboration with NAA about how transparent the process already is.
Yeah.
Governed largely by state and local law, where the lease document does outline a lot of these fees, and I know they're doing a lot of work to bring greater transparency to the lease document. Our hope is that the MITS data updates that we're working through will really help complement their work on the lease side, so that we're all moving in the same direction.
Okay, so I appreciate letting me going down the data nerd rabbit hole, but it's something again I'm passionate about. Let's talk the second major pillar you talked about, and that was the convening. Right now, OpTech is the show in town. Like it is, especially for those of us on the vendor partner side in technology, it's the Super Bowl. When it comes to that, how are you looking at expanding that conversation? Because I'll be honest, the way that RETTC was first presented to me was it's a way we can continue the conversation of OpTech throughout the year. The peer-to-peer that we talked about, and we're going to finish with the advocacy, really, I didn't see it in that initial vision. So how do you see the convening of this ongoing conversation happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think our goal really from the work that OpTech gives us through the calendar is really to continue the momentum of thought leadership. That's really what OpTech has always been. OpTech is a marketplace. OpTech is a convening of colleagues and peers and thought leaders who are in the market. I think RETTC really is a marketplace of ideas, right? So taking OpTech more product and solution based and taking it to a higher level is really the goal. And along that pipeline or along that chain, we're looking to create content and value for members in both the owner and operator side, but also in the supplier side, to give both universes an opportunity to engage with each other in an impactful way, education-based, compliance, navigating a regulatory or complex marketplace, all of these tools that are so desperately needed, putting it on more of a 365 posture. So that's going to mean additional in-person convenings, topically based, riding alongside of some of the other NMHC meetings that take place throughout the calendar, creating what we hope will be a really impactful spring RETTC meeting. It'll be the first of its kind here coming up in April of 25. But it's really limited to the point of making sure it's a curated experience, really flipping OpTech on its head, making sure that it's thought leadership, not sales, making sure that it's owner and operator driven and focused, but having supplier partners in the room and as part of that environment that are thought leaders, that are coming to the table to help drive the industry forward. So that we think is going to be a really impactful place. But I think more broadly speaking, what you'll see is RETTC, dip its toe into a lot of really cool and cutting edge virtual programming. So bringing to the market demo days to really help elevate some of our early seed or startup firms across the marketplace. really giving folks a pipeline to get attention and bring their solutions to bear. We'll certainly bring, webinars and updates from the regulatory or policy perspective, trends. All of those will continue to build out. But our hope is really just to build off of these different existing bodies of work and then look further. Let's reach into areas where NMHC had not been resourced properly from a technology standpoint, and let us go into areas that our members need us to, like construction tech or fintech or marketing tech. You pick your line. These are places where we see areas of growth and need, where our members, we hear it directly from the owner and operators, but I know the supplier community faces the same challenge, that you all are scattered so thin and running between industry and investor events in so many different places. We really need a central clearinghouse for all that is impactful to our operations and our enterprise.
Well, I'll tell you, as we just went through the exercise of laying out all of the conferences that we're going to be involved with as an organization, and I don't think I'm going to be home pretty much all of next year, because you're right, it is so dispersed and there are so many that are out there, but they, for the most part, a lot of them are cookie cutter. It's the same experience every time. It's one of the things, actually, I talked to Sharon about this last time I saw her, was if you look at the NMHC events, they are so distinctly different. It's mind-blowing. The annual meeting is so different than OpTech. And if you've only gone to an NMHC annual meeting, if you're a tech nerd at all in property, you need to go to OpTech. If you're in the industry and you want to understand kind of the way that properties move and go back and forth in the investment side of it, everything else, you need to go to annual meeting. But I'm excited to hear that there's going to be more of this discussion around, okay, what's next for the industry from a technology perspective at some of these other sessions, but also in novel ways, as you were describing. It's not just relying on the infrastructure you already have in place, but it sounds like you're looking at new infrastructure to put in place dedicated to it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think to your point, our industry is extremely diverse, right? Yes. It's part of the reason why it's hard to navigate from a technology perspective. And you see even suppliers coming to market or showing up at OpTech or showing up at Apartmentalize or CRETech, or you pick it, with what they think is this amazing, silver bullet. And it's really a single family solution that doesn't fit inside of our box, or vice versa. And so, I think what we do at NMHC, and certainly RETTC will carry this on, is making sure that the content is member driven, that it's curated, that it's not static, that it always tries to meet whatever that constant need is in the marketplace to help you all navigate it.
Yeah, no, it's and you guys do a great job at it. Just so kudos to you. Okay, so let's go on to the last of the three pillars, which is the one that I have become the most passionate about, but literally for, I'm going to say 29 years of my real estate career, didn't think twice about it. I'm just going to lay that on the table and be honest. And that is the advocacy portion of it. I guess I'll ask two questions. Number one, why is it so important now that we're talking about it? You touched on this a little bit. And then can you give a perspective to the listener as the way I like to put it, just how outgunned we are when you're thinking about advocacy on a governmental level? Sure.
Let me just start by saying advocacy is really where I got my start, right? So I breathe advocacy in almost everything I do. And it's amazing being at NMHC for almost a decade, seeing how far technology, industry facing and policy facing, has really shifted to become a front and center issue. What was 10 years ago a line item that the C-suite would look at with disdain and say, that's too much, or, we got to cut.
Why are we spending so much? Yep.
We got to cut infrastructure. We got to cut marketing budgets. We got to cut. It has now shifted to the point where it is not just front and center to the success of multifamily firms or real estate firms, but even more so that the technology focus from an advocacy standpoint has gotten so intense. The scrutiny over the role of big tech, the role of technology more broadly in society, has really, sort of come together, and for lack of a better, term, it's created this perfect storm, but also a perfect opportunity for us for RETTC to stop playing defense and go much more on the offense about the positive role of tech in the marketplace, the positive role of tech in improving resident outcomes, housing affordability, you pick it. But to be clear, advocacy has shifted to be such an operational issue that even as this past OpTech 2024, you look through that agenda or you look through other conferences, there was advocacy or regulatory threat or legal considerations weaved through much of that content, where 10 years ago, that was not the case. It was, right, how do I deploy managed Wi-Fi? This year, it was, how do I deploy managed Wi-Fi safely without regulatory encumbrance or threat? So there are still ways that we're looking at emerging tech, whether it's AI, whether it is managed Wi-Fi or other cutting edge solutions or infrastructure deployments or EV charging. All these things are really being pushed to market because of consumer need or business operational issues really driving that. But there is a regulatory piece that we need to do a better job of paying attention to, defending the industry when needed. And I think in many ways, building off of the legacy of NMHC in supporting the industry, really being a leader in the political and policy circles here in Washington, and taking that posture and that fight much more to a national level, not just federally facing, but making sure that our members, whether they are tech suppliers or tech investors or startups, owner-operators of rental properties or other real estate, that they're armed with the know-how and knowledge of how to fight back, how to show up at a town hall, how to show up at a zoning board meeting. Too often you show up in these community events or community meetings, and it's a room full of tenant advocates, many of whom we agree 99% of along the way. Too often, the room is empty of advocates for rental housing or for technology. So this is really an effort by RETTC to level up and build on NMHC's leadership in this space and give tools to the market and to our members to show up and make a difference.
Okay, so this is another area where I can jump in and say, okay, if everything's important, nothing is, and and you mentioned AI, so I'll start with there.
Yeah.
We need regulation around it on a federal level generally on this. It can't go hog wild and just its whole thing. But how are we thinking about framing the conversation and framing what we know as an industry to our lawmakers so that they can make the most informed decision for everyone involved? Like what's the thought process on that education around? We'll start with AI and then we'll go to kind of the other two pillars.
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, we talk about AI. If you remember 5-10 years ago, we were talking about blockchain, right? Like the emerging or hot tech that's being looked at from a policy perspective will constantly shift. Our job at RETTC really is to make sure that policymakers understand the way AI or other emerging tech is being used in the marketplace and the way it's benefiting downstream to our residents. I think when we look at the regulatory landscape or protections for consumers right now, we look at the Fair Housing Act, we look at Fair Credit Reporting Act, we look at very strong state and local landlord renter protections and laws on the books. And we feel pretty confident that that is a really strong pillar for consumer protection, even as AI is new and being rolled out across the space. Now, we also know that AI, or whatever variation of the name you want to call it, has been in the marketplace for a long time. It's just never received this level of consumer interest or public policy interest. So explaining to policymakers about the cool new tech that we saw at OpTech or that has been in the market for a while that's improving resident screening, mitigating bias, elevating folks, renters, consumer financial profiles or credit scores via rent payment reporting. The way we're seeing AI tools now being used to improve the efficiency of housing finance or multifamily finance. Its ability to drill into super antiquated and I would argue often way too discriminatory zoning and land use policy and find opportunities for investment and development of affordable and middle income housing. Those are huge wins. And that's where we really need policymakers to focus on the opportunity. And yes, we do believe that should consumer protection, be needed, we certainly want to partner with policymakers to make sure that they enact those guardrails, but do it in a way that it still allows innovation to flourish across the real estate space from a technology perspective.
So you said you're given the opportunity to share these, like the learnings from OpTech, et cetera, to lawmakers. Are they and their staffs listening? Like, are they open to the feedback?
Yeah, we had our first ever OpTech Advocacy Day. Granted, it was great that we were just on the doorstep of the Capitol at National Harbor, so we were able to pull it off. But we took 250 people up to Capitol Hill from OpTech, and by and large, people loved it. They got to hear from congressional staff talk about AI. They got to talk about, when you go behind the microphones and you go behind the personalities and the TV cameras, it's the congressional staff that are doing a lot of this work. It's the policy wonks. It's the dorks, right? I used to be one of them, and I appreciate their passion and their willingness to learn and hear all perspectives. So this is probably, I will say, in all of my time in DC, probably the first moment on a bipartisan basis that we have seen both the House and Senate truly try to get smart before they've gone down the road of regulation. So I'm actually really, I find a lot of encouragement here because you saw folks from all walks of the political spectrum come together for issue briefings, and we testified at one of them. We had Sonny Junasia with Canopy Analytics actually come into a closed door briefing with the House Financial Services Committee last year, and he did an amazing job, even in areas that weren't specific to Canopy's business, but just explaining tech in an environment and a forum where members of Congress or senators can let their guard down. They can ask stupid questions because guess what? They're as human as we are, and they don't know what they don't know. So they will walk in and ask something very simple, whether it's about large language models, whether it's about the resident screening process, you pick it. It really truly is a moment where I think everybody, just like across the consumer economy, is really encouraged by the promise of it, but worried about the risk. So how do we enact these guardrails? And I think this is a moment where they've done the right thing. Very different than what we've seen in previous exercises, whether it's about regulating social media or it's about data privacy. Those have not gone as well, and we've really floundered. And that's where you've seen some pretty big missteps by Congress or the federal government. On AI, we're seeing some progress in the right direction.
Well, and I want to echo what you were talking about with Advocacy Day, because I was fortunate enough to be among the 250 that went there, and it truly did change my perspective on the industry and how we all need to be involved with that. I was sitting in a room with congressional staffers, as you mentioned. You mentioned you used to be one. My wife used to be a staffer for the governor of California and the deputy mayor of San Diego. So I pretty much threw you a softball question. Like I knew the answer I was going to get. But they were very open to listening. And it was a group of us that included 2 CEOs of broadband communication companies, 3 different executives from owners and operators of real estate, myself, obviously, from the lease insurance side of it. And then we also had two lawyers and a representative of the NMHC group that was there. Mm-hmm. And what I found was those staffers were not just open to listening, actively curious and wanting to get the information. So if you have that opportunity, definitely take advantage of it. And I'm excited to hear that we're going to be doing more advocacy as an organization as well. So we talked about AI, but that's not the only area that we're focused in. RETTC is focused in on from an advocacy perspective. Talk to me about the I guess the second one, which would be the connectivity one that we're really looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. This is as many of our owners and operators across the industry can attest to, but certainly on the technology supplier side, it really has become the backbone of modern multifamily. Whether it's a bulk internet billing system, whether it's a managed Wi-Fi system, whether it's 2 or 3 providers on site, the question over whether or not you have reliable, robust, and affordable broadband service on site at a multifamily property is a differentiator. If you do not have high quality, highly reliable service, you will lose that prospective resident. They will go across the street to where there is better service.
They have to have it for their life these days. I mean, that's your life centers around it.
Yeah. And I think it was certainly the case pre-COVID, but now post-COVID, it is not even a question. It used to be funny when we did renter preferences surveys years ago, and you would rank, what are your top must-have features? And it would be, high-speed internet and air conditioning, in-unit washer and dryer. Those are, largely seen as must-haves to the point it doesn't even rank on a survey anymore.
Correct.
A person wouldn't even walk through that door. So when we look at the regulatory landscape or the legislative landscape, there's a story of, it's a tale of two cities. It's much of multifamily is well served, has, abundant, choice or gigabit fast blazing internet service for dirt cheap, and residents are well served, and the property is operating sustainability or other smart tech, on these networks all seamlessly. We say it's, curb to couch. The resident has this amazing experience from a technology perspective, and life is good. The sad reality is that there is a segment of the marketplace, and it's the lower income, affordable housing space, senior housing, smaller properties, where that's just simply not the case. We have aging infrastructure. We have a lack of investment from some providers. We have a lack of subsidy or support from the government to make that change. So we're really pushing, policymakers to acknowledge that much of what's happened in the multifamily broadband market has been a success. Bulk billing, managed Wi-Fi choice, the competition is strong. The partnership model between broadband providers and property owners is something that's really worked, and we need to look to leverage that as we look at other areas of the market that do need more support, that do need new infrastructure. So we've been strongly supporting things like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provided a critical subsidy to low-income renters across the country to afford broadband. And in many cases, we're looking for ways for our owners to work in partnership with other stakeholders, whether it be public or private organizations, to subsidize that cost, to give free service to residents, because we know that access to the internet, just like access to a quality home, is a game changer in outcomes.
Yeah, no, it was this one. My eyes got opened again. I keep going back to Advocacy Day, but as I mentioned, I was sitting there with the CEO of two different broadband companies, or I guess bulk Wi-Fi companies, and I mean, I'm in the industry. I'm talking to people every day about things in the industry, and I had no idea that this was such a pivotal issue in our industry and potentially under such scrutiny until Advocacy Day. So again, it's another reason that I'm highly encouraging people to get involved with these different organizations, especially RETTC, so you can be tuned into what are all the other elements of the industry that, especially on the supplier side. The supplier side, very much, we tend to work in our little silo of the business and not think about, okay, all the other things that the people we're serving are actually thinking about and the threats that are on there, which actually brings me to what I believe is the last pillar. Please quote me if I'm wrong on that, but I think the last pillar really is, data security and really data governance within the industry. I've got that one right?
You do, yeah. That's our third major policy priority moving into 2025, and a new Congress, a new government. A lot of big changes happen in Washington, but we are well placed given the strong support this industry has gotten across the board from policymakers. Being bipartisan really has worked well for us. And when you look at data security and privacy, it has been frustrating to watch this unfold. In the absence of concrete federal action in this space, we now face a landscape of 50 plus data security and privacy requirements across the country. So for an industry like ours that often operates across state lines, it can be an operational nightmare, a legal and compliance burden that is significant. Even where we have international reach, compliance with GDPR stemming from Europe was the tip of the spear. Quickly following was California with the CCPA. Quickly following that was a number of states, and we're seeing even more become aggressive in this area. But from our standpoint, what we've been doing for the last several years under NMHC, and we've done this in partnership with NAA and others in the real estate environment, has really been pushing federal policymakers to get serious about this. That this patchwork of often duplicative or contradictory requirements from one state to the next or one jurisdiction to the next ultimately harms consumers. And it leaves businesses in a very tough position of needing to comply with this very heavy burden from a financial and legal perspective that ultimately detracts from our core mission, which is to build and provide quality and housing for millions of Americans. So, for an industry like ours, when we walk into a room, and I think this gets to your larger point about, how do we stack in the bigger advocacy picture in DC or across the national landscape? We walk into an office and say, I'm with NMHC or I'm with RETTC, and we're here to advocate for a national data security and privacy standard, and here's why. Many offices or many congressional representatives or regulators look at you like, oh, wow, I never connected the dots between why a multifamily firm would care so deeply about data security and privacy. And once you start peeling back the layers and explain to them from prospect through the resident life cycle or through development through operation, we are an extremely data intensive industry and often rely heavily on third-party suppliers to carry or execute much of that work. So we need strong legal protections. We need strong data protections. We need strong contractual obligations put in place to protect both sides of that relationship and ultimately to protect our residents. So, I think we've made a lot of progress. We've worked closely with the Financial Services Committee and the Senate Banking Committee and folks here in Washington. And for the first time, and we're hopeful that this moves, goes into the next Congress with momentum, is for the first time we had a bipartisan and bicameral, meaning a House and Senate bill introduced that would set up a national data privacy and security standard, better protect kids' online privacy, elevate, in many cases, jurisdictions don't have data security or privacy requirements, really lift the floor, making sure that both businesses are protected and so is the end user consumer. So we're bullish on this. In the absence of federal action, we'll continue to see this work spread across the states, but that's where RETTC will work to make sure that not only are we pushing at the federal level, but we're going to make sure members are armed with tools, out in the field so that they can push in the state and local level to make sure that if they are going to enact a new data security or privacy requirement or limitations on some type of tech, that you all have the tools necessary to engage in conversation and advocacy.
Well, that is where I want to go next, is kind of how can people get involved and what are kind of the resources they can depend on. But before we do that, as you were describing the difference in the data policies across, the state and the federal level and different state requirements and local requirements, and yes, Europe did lead the way kind of setting these up. If an operator out there is thinking, okay, this probably isn't going to be that big a deal for me, I want you to think about your security deposits and the rules that are around the security deposits, and where even in an individual county, you have to handle interest rates and how that's paid out differently than in a different state that you might operate in. Yeah. We're talking about the same type of bespoke regulation around the data security in that. And that's why, to reemphasize your point, I think it is so important that we're able to develop a federal level minimum expectation kind of aspect on that. So it's a pain point in the world that I live in that I can directly point to that goes, it's just like this, guys, except something different.
Yeah, I mean, LeaseLock, to you all credit, has been the leader in monitoring and having to navigate that tough state and local landscape where you're right, within a state or within a county, you may have 15 different treatments of security deposits or other resident facing technologies or practices. Those things are hugely impactful to the bottom line, and how residents are ultimately impacted is of huge importance. So we're gonna work with folks like LeaseLock, like some of your partners in that space, and the owner operator community, to make sure that policymakers understand before they go down the road of repealing requirements or preventing certain business practices, that they understand what that means to the renter in the long term, what it means to their financial history, to their financial outcomes. All of that needs to be taken into account before they upend the marketplace.
And to your point, the only way that can happen is by someone getting in front of them and having the conversation and sending letters, et cetera. So let's kind of bring this towards a close, Kevin, because I appreciate all the time you've given me. Yeah. How like it's two questions. Number one, we just came off of an election, as you put it. There's a new administration coming in, a whole new leadership in the Senate, leadership in the House, all of that's changing. So my first question is, does this still matter, or can we take a breath? And then my second question will be, okay, how do people get involved with the efforts?
Yeah. I think advocacy has never been more important. I think we're at a moment where, and we certainly heard this at OpTech Advocacy Day from both regulators and policymakers, the time for people to sit on the back bench and let it all just take place has passed. We need active advocates on the field at every moment, at every turn, at every level of government. So for us, that means at RETTC, we are well placed in partnership with NMHC to have solid bipartisan relationships in place that will help us navigate whether it's housing policy debates or technology policy debates, whether it's regulatory or legislative. We're going to be well situated as an industry to navigate those. But there will be challenges ahead, and both from as a new administration comes in, the Trump team will come in, assess the regulatory landscape, assess what their priorities are, and we will have to go educate a whole new crop of folks. 2024 not only saw change in power, but we saw large shifts of members of Congress and senators who've stepped away. So we have a whole new freshman class, hundreds of new members of Congress that we need to educate on tech policy, housing policy, tax policy, and we have our hands full with a lot of these fights coming next year. So it's going to be an all hands on deck moment, and we're really excited about leveling up that advocacy, building off of OpTech Advocacy Day this past October, and really make it into a 24/7, 365 presence and tools that you all can use on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so we can't take a breath. We need to stay in the fight, which is kind of the answer I was expecting. And when you're thinking about that freshman class, I hadn't thought about it until you just brought it up. That freshman class is also going to have every other advocacy group in the country, regardless of industry, fighting for their time. So it's why I think, to your point, it's even more important that we all kind of join the fight and be able to make sure that our voices are heard. So to that end, how do people, both on an individual level and on a corporate level, get involved with RETTC? Yeah.
So RETTC.org, RETTC.org has a plethora of information on how to get engaged on a membership basis. We are a big tent. We're welcoming any and all members who support the mission and vision of RETTC, which is really to amplify that message that tech is a force for good in real estate. It has positive impacts on resident outcomes and addressing our nation's long-term housing challenges. And it's really just scratching the surface. So we have a long way to go. Taking that message is hugely important at the federal level, but really distilling it down to the state and local level where so much of this action really takes place. And while, we're just coming off the heels of a, very heated, very divisive national election, and regardless of our personal feelings on which way the wind blew, let's be very clear. The stakes have never been higher for our businesses, for our operations, for our communities, and for our residents, the folks that we're all here to serve. So, while we all may be tired, we all probably are looking forward to Thanksgiving and the holidays to take a break. Very simply, we can't. The stakes are too high. So we ask you to join us at RETTC. Join us at NMHC. Look to your partner organizations across the real estate landscape like NAA. The affiliate organizations across the country are all hugely important as we face a very tumultuous public policy and advocacy landscape over the next several years.
Excellent. Well, Kevin, I appreciate you coming on and discussing, the advent of RETTC and what the goals are and how we can all help. Really, really appreciate your time and appreciate your perspective.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us.